You read the Bible, Brett?
Yes.
Well, there's this passage I got memorized. Sort of fits this occasion. Ezekiel 25:17. The path of the righteous man is beset on all sides by the iniquities of the selfish and the tyranny of evil men. Blessed is he who in the name of charity and goodwill shepherds the weak through the valley of darkness, for he is truly his brother's keeper and the finder of lost children. And I will strike down upon thee with great vengeance and furious anger those who attempt to poison and destroy my brothers. And you will know my name is the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon thee.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Welcome back to Cineversary, a new podcast that celebrates a milestone anniversary of a masterful work of cinema. Every month we wish a happy birthday to a different film currently observing a joyous jubilee. Everything from a 20th all the way to a 100th anniversary. I'm your host, Eric Martin, creator and moderator of the Cineverse Film Discussion Group that meets weekly in the Chicagoland area. We're now well into April, and that means it's time to honor the 25th anniversary of one of the most beloved and influential films of the last quarter century. It's Pulp Fiction, directed by Quentin Tarantino. And like any good birthday party, Cineversary invites special guests to join us in the commemoration. This month, I'll be teaming up with Adam Kempenaar. He's co-host of the long-running show Film Spotting, a weekly podcast and radio program from Chicago. Adam and I will discuss why Pulp Fiction is worth celebrating all these years later, its cultural impact and legacy, what we can learn from the picture today, how it stood the test of time, and more. Before we delve into Tarantino's tour de force, however, it's only proper that I share the backstory on this month's movie. So Wikipedia reports that Pulp Fiction is a 1994 American crime film written and directed by Tarantino and based on a story by Tarantino and Roger Avary. Starring John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson, Bruce Willis, Tim Roth, Ving Rhames, and Uma Thurman, it tells several stories of criminal Los Angeles. The film's title refers to the pulp magazines and hard-boiled crime novels popular during the mid-20th century, known for their graphic violence and punchy dialogue. Tarantino wrote Pulp Fiction in 1992 and 93, incorporating scenes that Avary originally wrote for the film True Romance that came out in 1993. Its plot occurs out of chronological order. The film is also self-referential from its opening moments, beginning with a title card that gives us two dictionary definitions of quote-unquote pulp. Considerable screen time is also devoted to monologues and casual conversations with eclectic dialogue revealing each character's perspectives on several subjects, and the film features an ironic combination of humor and strong violence. TriStar Pictures reportedly turned down the script as, quote, too demented, unquote. Miramax co-chairman Harvey Weinstein, however, was enthralled, and the film became the first that Miramax fully financed. Pulp Fiction won the Palme d'Or at the 1994 Cannes Film Festival and was a major critical and commercial success. It was nominated for 7 Oscars, including Best Picture, and won Best Original Screenplay. It earned Travolta, Jackson, and Thurman Academy Award nominations and revitalized and/or elevated their careers. Its development, marketing, distribution, and profitability had a sweeping effect on independent cinema. Pulp Fiction has been widely regarded as Tarantino's masterpiece, with particular praise for its screenwriting. The self-reflexivity, unconventional structure, and extensive homage and pastiche have led critics to describe it as a touchstone of postmodern film. It's often considered a cultural watershed, influencing movies and other media that adopted elements of its style. In 2008, Entertainment Weekly named Pulp Fiction the best film since 1983, and it has appeared on many critics' lists of the greatest films ever made. On Rotten Tomatoes, Pulp Fiction earns a 93% score and an average critical rating of 9.2 out of 10. On the American Film Institute's 2007 list of the 100 greatest American films of all time, Pulp Fiction ranked number 94. And on the AFI's list of 100 most thrilling American films, the movie clocked in at number 53. In 2013, Pulp Fiction was selected for preservation in the United States National Film Registry by the Library of Congress as culturally, historically, or aesthetically significant. It was first shown at the Cannes Film Festival on May 12, 1994, and made its wide-release theatrical debut on October 14th of that year. The movie's budget is estimated at $8.5 million, but that was paid back in spades by a $213.9 million box office gross. Perk your ears now to the film's original trailer.
Miramax Films is proud to present one of the most celebrated motion pictures of the year. The winner of the 1994 Palme d'Or, the best picture of the Cannes Film Festival.
Come on, let's get in character. Why are you so interested in Big Man's wife?
Well, he's going out of town, Florida, and he asked me if I'd take care of her while he's gone.
Take care of you?
No, man. Just show her a good time, make sure she don't get lonely. Girl. You see, this is a moral test of oneself.
I do believe Marcellus, my husband, your boss, told you to take me out and do whatever I wanted.
Whether or not you can maintain loyalty.
Night of the fight, you may feel a slight sting. Pride only hurts. It never helps. In the fifth, your ass goes down.
I have to say, you play with matches, you get burned.
We should have shotguns for this kind of deal.
We're in a lot of danger, aren't we?
I'm prepared to scour the earth for that night.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did I break your concentration?
Get down, get down.
You got a corpse in a car, minus the head in the garage. Take me to it.
Don't you hate that?
Hey, what?
Uncomfortable silences.
John Travolta, Samuel L. Jackson, Uma Thurman, Harvey Keitel, Tim Roth, Amanda Plummer, Maria de Medeiros, Bing Rames, Eric Stoltz, Rosanna Arquette, Christopher Walken, and Bruce Willis.
Looking at something, friend? Ain't my friend, Luca.
Die, you mother!
A new film directed by Quentin Tarantino. Pulp Fiction.
You really thinking about quitting?
Most definitely.
What's you gonna do then?
Basically, I'm just gonna walk the earth.
What you mean walk the earth?
You know, like Kane in Kung Fu.
All right, I want to welcome Adam Kempenaar from Film Spotting. Thank you for appearing on Cineversary, and I take it you're a big fan of Pulp Fiction.
I am. Thanks, Eric, for having me on the show. And absolutely, Pulp Fiction is a movie I actually haven't seen too many times. I think I've only seen it 3 times, though it's one of those films that whenever it's on, you kind of get stuck watching it. You know, I'm thinking about 3 times from start to finish, but if it ever comes on, there's so many memorable scenes and moments that you kind of get glued to it.
Absolutely. So can you remember when and where you first saw the film?
I can, and I'd love to hear your answer too, but I looked this up to verify that my memory wasn't playing tricks with me, and I think the date on IMDb was October 19th, 1994. So that checks out with my memory. I was a sophomore at Grinnell College. We would have been on our mid-semester break, so fall break, basically. I don't remember, maybe a week after taking our mid-semester exams. And for the first time, I went down to St. Louis with my roommate, Kevin, who actually, for any Film Spotting fans listening, is the guy who introduced me to Sam, who I started the show with, the guy who introduced me to Maddie, who later became a co-host, and he's a theater professor now at the University of Colorado in Boulder. So he was my roommate, and he said, why don't you come with me down to St. Louis and meet my family and meet my friends, and we'll just hang out for a little bit. And I thought that sounded like fun. And that was the weekend this movie opened. And having been a huge fan of Reservoir Dogs, that film kind of being the film I point to, I think, as really igniting my love of film, or at least making me think, there's something more to this than just you're kind of passing the time with your friends and you go see a movie because what else is there to do? And there were lots of films I loved, but that was the first movie where I was really aware of it being directed by someone and was fascinated by how it was made. And so when Pulp Fiction came out, of course I had to see Quentin Tarantino's second film. So I was in St. Louis, just in a suburban multiplex, and saw it that weekend that it opened. And I have to admit, and I'm kind of embarrassed to admit it, but I think I was mostly stunned by it because it felt so radical at the time in terms of its structure. Obviously, the nonlinear thing is something Tarantino had done in Reservoir Dogs, but that episodic sort of chapter approach felt brand new. The way it all ultimately did come back to connect was something that you didn't quite know if it was going to pay off in that way or not. And it was just so different from Reservoir Dogs. I think other than the crime milieu and that nonlinear approach, it was such a different movie, a little bit goofier, a little bit funnier. Obviously, the stakes from the very beginning of Reservoir Dogs, I mean, once you get past that scene in the diner, it's just so intense. And Pulp Fiction has moments like that, but doesn't necessarily try to sustain it throughout. So I think I went in, like a lot of idiots, I suppose, I wanted Tarantino to just make the same album again. I was like, where's Reservoir Dogs? And I got a very different film, and I was kind of stunned. And then I think later that next summer, I saw it again with some friends at a theater in Des Moines, Iowa. It was called the Bruin View. It was my first experience where you could order food and order drinks. And even though I was 19 at the time, might have had a few adult beverages, and that was where it all clicked. You were just watching it with a packed house. The St. Louis experience was just a few people in the theater, was not sold out at the time, and watching it in Des Moines with people having a good time and just laughing at everything. And that was where I really plugged into everything about it, the humor of it and what he was doing in terms of dialogue and some of the camera tricks, if you will, that Tarantino likes to do. That's where on that second viewing that it really resonated with me.
Wow. Well, what a hell of an answer. You win the Cupid doll for the guest with the most colorful and descriptive, recollective answer to that question. I always ask these same questions of my guests, and you got it down to almost the minute in terms of remembering the date and where you were. I don't remember what I had for breakfast, Adam. I mean, that's pretty impressive.
That's a really nice way, Eric, of saying I gave the longest answer.
No, I loved every minute of it. But you know what? It was the details. I mean, you and Tarantino are kind of kindred spirits. You like those little details. So, and real quickly, I saw it in the theater. I think it was a week or two after it came out. I don't have as vivid a recollection other than being blown away, but it was my first Tarantino experience. I later went to Reservoir Dogs after being so impressed with this movie. I wanted to segue into, you kind of segued for me, but I want to formally ask you why this movie is worth celebrating 25 years later. Adam, why does it still matter, and how has it stood the test of time?
It's a great question. I think obviously because Tarantino still matters. I mean, here we are just a few months away from Once Upon a Time in Hollywood coming out. I think for most film fans, it's one of the events of the summer that we're all waiting for. And obviously you can love him or hate him, but you're always going to be fascinated by him and provoked by him. And he's just very clearly one of the titans of cinema, and has been since going back to the early 90s with the two films we referenced, Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs. So because he matters, and I think will continue to matter for some time, I think this movie, being the film that was his breakout film, is going to be relevant. But for me, great filmmaking is great filmmaking. If there's wonderful cinematography and editing, and obviously the dialogue, I'm sure we'll talk about that more, and the performances, those never go out of style or never get dated in my mind. And I would also throw out there too that how does a movie get dated when it's completely out of time to begin with, right? There's this bizarre anachronistic thing that we get in Pulp Fiction that's so much fun, where the soundtrack is out of the 70s and the 60s, but also the 50s, and even the kind of nondescript costumes that the hitmen wear, those black and white suits, and the pulp material itself, that's straight out of the 1930s and 40s, but of course it's all wrapped in this modern sensibility and the language. So in some ways, just by not pinning it down to a certain period of time, I think he's made it I think he's made it timeless. And for me too, and maybe this is something we'll talk a little bit more about. Tarantino's preoccupation with performance and just his sort of infatuation with words is something I'm always drawn to, and I think is always going to be fascinating. The way storytelling is so important within the stories he's telling. I think about Reservoir Dogs and the whole thing about Tim Roth is he's playing a role, and his mentor explains to him on the roof how he has to be naturalistic. He has to be Marlon Brando, and we could point to so many other characters and moments in Tarantino movies, but of course, Inglourious Bastards, that opening scene with Hans Landa is almost like he's directing his own play. He's completely in control and kind of knows exactly what's going to happen and is going to do whatever it takes or say whatever it takes to make those moments happen. And the whole scene, the amazing scene with Michael Fassbender and his downfall is all because he doesn't play his part right. He doesn't play it authentically. So I love the way storytelling is so important to Tarantino. We get some of that here. We could point to a lot of things, but even that Christopher Walken scene, of course, the very memorable scene talking to the young Butch is this story, even if it's ostensibly a true story. He's such a wonderful storyteller there. And just the way words are so important in this film on a third viewing. And we did have a recent rewatch of this, I think on its 20th anniversary. We did what we do on Film Spotting, a Sacred Cow review, where we take a movie we haven't seen in a while that most people acclaim and love and go back and see if it holds up. And definitely Josh and myself felt that way about this film. And one of the things that really stood out was the way Tarantino draws attention to his own dialogue, right? Even the very beginning of the film is them talking about what words mean when he was over in France and Royale with cheese and lines like it's not a chopper, it's a motorcycle, or it's a chopper, not a motorcycle, and garçon means boy, and even the great line where I think Samuel L. Jackson and Travolta are talking and he says something about him being fat. And he says, well, I wouldn't go so far as to call him fat. It's just the way people interpret words and how you stand behind the words and how kind of your choice of words is something that is so important to this film. And for me, that's just something that is always going to be fun about it.
Yeah, well said. I would say that the movie matters because, just kind of picking up from where you left off too, it bucks so many conventions of the traditional Hollywood narrative, right? I mean, what are the rules broken here? Rules that, you have to tell a linear story with a clearly structured beginning and told in proper order and infused with conflict and resolution that's dramatized in a straight line. That gangster and crime figures have to conform to particular stereotypes. I mean, this is a decidedly different take on cliche characters like the professional hitman and his targets, the underworld kingpin and his mole, lovers on the run, etc. That these conventional crime characters have to abide by the language and lexicon laws of the cinematic universe. So instead of the predictable dialogue you usually get in crime pictures, this film is replete with casual everyday banter, funny anecdotes, otherwise disposable lines that everyday people would say in the real world, not the predictable world of typical movie personalities.
Yeah.
Also, the tone of a Pulp Fiction story, traditionally had to be consistently dark or violent or serious or noirish. Instead, here you've got, this movie conjures up big laughs and smiles, as well as gasps and cringes and teeth gnashing and hand wringing. So interestingly, there's consistent suspense, even when the mood suddenly shifts to something funny or more lighthearted. And that tonality, I think, is just brilliant.
Yeah, I agree. And also I'll just add that to your point, in the way it bucks convention, we have mostly characters, and this is somewhat common in crime movies, but atypical of most Hollywood films, we don't really have any character that we're really rooting for. We have characters that we're fascinated by, maybe sometimes horrified by. We love how cool they may or may not be, but at the same time, there isn't anyone I'd say that we are genuinely sympathetic towards, and our sympathies grow for certain characters. I'd say we're probably rooting for Bruce Willis to get his watch back and to get away from Marcellus, but for the most part, there's not a lot that's overly redeeming. A key word there with this film, I think, redeeming about characters like the one Travolta plays or Jules, Samuel L. Jackson, until they are redeemed or not.
Right. Yeah, I have a theory about this. I want to tackle with you in just a little bit. But my next question is, in what ways do you think Pulp Fiction was influential on cinema and popular culture or set trends in any way? Boy, we can go on for hours with this, but what would you say?
I think you touched on it in terms of just some of those chances it takes with narrative and that structure, I think is really key. I was just jotting down off the top of my head some of the films that came in its wake, and we probably could come up with a list of 20 or 25 imitators, right? I mean, films in one way or another, the type of dialogue, sometimes the approach, maybe being crime centered, but also in largely using that nonlinear structure. I think a lot of these films tried that as well, whether it's Go or The Way of the Gun or 2 Days in the Valley. Even, I know a movie you love because you mentioned it to me off air, City of God. When I saw City of God for the first time, I was thinking about Pulp Fiction. So many films and filmmakers have been influenced by, I think in particular, that narrative structure, the kind of messy, unclear chronology is a big part of it, without a doubt. And, another part of it that is worth noting, I think, is just the way it casts certain people, and that choice to cast John Travolta, a guy who, I grew up with watching Grease as a young kid, and certainly other films, and being aware of stuff like Saturday Night Fever, but someone who was pretty much completely off the radar. And this film brings him back. This is the film that, because of Tarantino, we get Shorty, and we get some other really good performances out of John Travolta that we may not otherwise have gotten.
Right. No, that's a good point. So, I could go on for a long time here, but I'll try to summarize a little bit some of my thoughts about this. So, Pulp Fiction, let's agree. It encouraged filmmakers to explore more crime fiction characters and plots. It made creepy and degenerate and underworld and unsavory characters more acceptable to the mainstream, provided that they were, like interestingly shaped or offered distinctive dialogue and they weren't stereotypical or cliched. I think it introduced a new era where colorful and credible dialogue, you talked about this so eloquently just a little bit ago, a new era where it can serve as the heart of a story, a character unto itself that helps move the plot along. I also think the curious tonality of Pulp Fiction, it alternates between sudden extreme and repulsive violence and ironic comedy. I think that tone emboldened filmmakers to explore more violent and disturbing content in situations counterbalanced by, hipster humor and black comedy. It's also that narrative, that nonlinear narrative, and the time shifts. I think it made it cool to tell a different kind of story that forces the audience to pay more attention and derive meaning from a non-traditional three-act structure. And of course, it's got numerous pop culture references and nods to earlier films that, let's face it, made it fun to pay attention and identify all the influences and the winks to the audience. And consider that the movie feels very fresh and timely, and yet it continually harkens back to a bygone culture as well as older films and songs. The references come fast and furious. You've got things like the Pepsi Challenge, A Flock of Seagulls, the Quarter Pounder with Cheese, Speed Racer, Fruit Brute cereal, Madonna's Lucky Star period, The Three Stooges, Clutch Cargo, Green Acres, Fonzie, The Guns of the Navarone, 1950s icons like Marilyn Monroe, Buddy Holly, and James Dean. And then you think about the small handful of films and works of literature that Pulp Fiction references or was inspired by, right? Like The Killing or Kiss Me Deadly, Deliverance, The Bodyguard, Charlie Varick, J.D. Salinger's Glass Family Anthology Tales, books by Elmore Leonard and Charles Wilford. As you said, it rejuvenated the careers of John Travolta and Bruce Willis and put Samuel L. Jackson on the map as the cool actor everybody wanted to cast. And of course, it demonstrated that a lower budget independent movie could be an A-list picture. It drew big audiences. It garnered major award nominations. It produced big profits. This is the flick that turned Miramax into a critical and commercial powerhouse and dominated independent cinema for many years thereafter. I know Miramax is kind of a bad word today, but this is the film that kind of put him on the map.
For sure, absolutely.
If nothing else, Adam, Pulp Fiction made surf music cool again, if only for a little while, right?
Yeah, it probably for me put it on my radar completely as someone living in Iowa my entire life. It wasn't something other than a little bit of Beach Boys knowledge that I was very familiar with, certainly before this movie. And the box office thing is interesting too, because I think I always knew that this film was relatively low budget. That was part of the narrative here behind this film and how it was such a juggernaut in 1994. But I think I read it was made for $8 million, which that's remarkable. I certainly did not remember that it was quite that low budget. It's not a film by any means that you feel that when you're watching it now.
Yeah, 8 to 8.5 million according to Wikipedia, and the box office was 214 million.
Not bad.
Which says a lot. Yeah. And that's $1994. So Exactly. And then again, just in answer to this question, you think of the host of imitators. You've already rattled off several movies that kind of copycats, or at least try to pick up some of the vibe. Other movies you could make a case for here. I'm not saying they're good movies, but Destiny Turns on the Radio, Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead, The Usual Suspects, Suicide Kings, Eight Heads in a Duffel Bag, Amoris Peros, Reindeer Games, The Way of the Gun, Zero Effect, Memento, Be Cool, Boondock Saints. The list goes on, right?
Yeah.
What's the moral to the story here, Adam? What themes or messages are explored in Pulp Fiction besides the fact that Jack Rabbit Slims has good milkshakes?
Yeah, we certainly all remember that. I like this question as it applies to this movie because I think moral really is the key word. In fact, Travolta's character, Vincent Vega, says it at one point. He says, "This is a moral test," when he's talking about the night, the date, if you will, that he's about to have with Mia Wallace, with Uma Thurman. And this is certainly not something I picked up on the first time I watched it, or even the second time I watched it, but it was this more recent viewing where I realized one of the kind of connective threads with the film, and one of the themes that Tarantino is playing with throughout. And I don't think it's a case where he's actually trying to impart a moral in the traditional sense that there's a lesson, but as far as elevating the material, I mean, you see this with a lot of Pulp Fiction. The what makes it Pulp Fiction is that it's of course it's kind of messy, and it might even be a little bit vulgar, but in the end, characters are wrestling with something larger, usually, and there's some sort of existential crisis at its core that I think maybe justifies or justifies the time that you're investing in it, and that kind of, if you feel bad about the fact that you're kind of just slumming a little bit with this material, there is often some kind of payoff, something that really hits you, maybe not as much in the head, but really in the gut. And in this film, what it is this idea that we see come up again and again of redemption, of characters sort of wrestling with some kind of moral quandary and coming out the other side of it, or not, being tested in some way.
That's
trying
right.
to figure out what they really are made of, what they really believe in, if the words that they say really are matched by their actions. I mean, that's the whole opening dialogue. That whole exchange between Jules and Vincent is about Vincent wondering if he's going to be able to go out with Mia and have a good time with her, and no matter how attracted he is to her or what she does or how the night plays out, he's not going to do the wrong thing and act on his attraction. You have someone like Butch who, this ultimate test that happens with Marcellus, where first he can't swallow his pride and throw the fight, but then this watch, which he says he cares about as much as he does, he proves it. He proves it by going back, even though it's the dumbest thing in the world and he's risking death. He goes back to get that watch because it's that important to him. And you could go back to the story of his father and the test his father went through in order to save that watch. And even I love at the end, I think what kind of cued me into it is that, at the end, he could leave Marcellus to die, but he doesn't. He goes back for him and actually saves him. And in turn, Marcellus, of course, allows him to live. And then when Butch, he opens up the pawn shop door, the motorcycle's there and the key's in his hand, like as if this kind of wonderful moment where by doing the right thing, it's paid off for him. And of course, you go out and the motorcycle has a name, and the name is Grace. It's not an accident that Tarantino names that motorcycle Grace. And the whole, I haven't even mentioned Ezekiel 25:17 and the fact that that whole end dialogue is all about Ringo being saved, getting his life back, and in turn, Jules not saving his life, and in doing so saves his soul. Perhaps that is that underlying current that really does run through every character in the film. This idea of salvation or redemption, and again, I think it's one of those things that kind of makes the film even more rewarding when you can go back to it and spot that element.
Well, Adam, you just stole all my thunder. I don't know what to say now, no, but I'll riff on what you said. Absolutely. I totally agree here. I think there is a meaning and a moral here, as you just laid out. It's about passing the test, one after another. So first, think about Vincent. He's faced with this trial of loyalty. Can he resist the tempting wife of his underworld boss? And then second, as you said, ponder Butch's attachment to his watch and what that watch represents. It's an heirloom of honor passed down from brave and admirable ancestors in the military, right? Instead of leaving Marcellus to a fate of indignity and torture at the hands of his captors, he chooses to do the brave thing by selecting a weapon symbolic of honor and skill, a samurai sword. And thus, Butch passes the test of honor and distinguishes himself as not just another American whose names, quote, don't mean bleep, unquote.
Mm-hmm.
And then third, Jules, he confronts this test of faith. And which path will he choose, that of the shepherd or the tyranny of evil men? So that the incident in the apartment where he and Vincent are miraculously spared from certain death, that, of course, inspires Jules to seek a more enlightened path and abandon his violent ways. And then in the coffee shop, he seems to pass this test by de-escalating the Mexican standoff situation and letting Pumpkin and Honey Bunny depart with his blood money and their lives. I think there's another message in the movie, too, and it's a little more garbled and kind of coddled together here, but I came up with, how about this? Luck and fortune smiles on the brave, the stupid, and the undeserving. So consider, Adam, how Jules and Vincent are magically spared from close-range bullets, how Butch finds a way to kill the hitman stalking him, even up things with Marcellus, and get away with the girl and the money, and how Marcellus is ironically saved by Butch, and how Vincent saves his hide by bringing Mia back from an overdose.
Yeah, no, you do absolutely see that. I think we can add into this mix too the fact that Vincent in the end is met with his demise, right? In a pretty ignominious way. He is someone who, even though the chronology is messed up here, you have to consider that even though he's been given all the signs, just like Jules, he has seen all of the signposts on that path to redemption and has chosen to overlook them and has decided that they don't mean anything, and he's going to continue on the path that he has previously gone down.
Mm-hmm.
And he's the one who we see suffer. He's the one who we see die, I think, because of that choice.
Yeah, well put. All right, Adam, I'm trying hard to be the shepherd, but what elements from this movie have aged well and what elements are maybe showing some wrinkles?
Well, for sure, the last time I watched it, what stood out to me in terms of still being amazing, or maybe even appreciating more, Samuel L. Jackson as Jules. You're right. The film, that obviously he was an established actor by this point, had some really good performances, but this is the one that really made him that go-to badass actor. And that Jules performance, everything about the way he inhabits that character and the fun he has with that dialogue, it was just as thrilling, as I said, if not more so, watching it again. I also was really struck by how much I loved Bruce Willis's performance this time.
Mm-hmm.
I've come to appreciate him more as an actor over time, especially as I've recognized that he seems to be on a mission to be as still and restrained and kind of quiet and stoic as he can be without being boring.
Yeah, right.
It's really hard to pull off, but he has pulled it off time and time again, and I think he pulls it off here as well. But also some of the things we've touched on, the soundtrack, the dark comedy of it all, the wordplay, the camera play, and the homages, the Kiss Me Deadly, certainly with the glowing suitcase and everything else, that all played just as well as it did in 94 for me. And again, if not even better. Now, what didn't work about the film? I can't wait to hear your answer. And the only things that stood out to me upon the recent rewatch, the Bonnie situation. There's plenty about the Bonnie situation that is fun and does work, but Quentin Tarantino still is a pretty terrible actor, and that performance as Jimmy, I don't think gets any better with age. And of course, the dialogue that he gives Jimmy and some of those phrases. The reality is, yes, we live in a time now that's maybe less forgiving of political incorrectness, but in 94, it was awkward and uncomfortable when he's saying, do you see a sign that says dead blank storage on it, and then he repeats it. And
Right.
And it's not even so much, again, that I'm recoiling because of the kind of racism or the whether or not he should or shouldn't be saying that. It's not funny. It's just so poorly delivered. And the line itself is just not good. And I actually think, as much as I like Harvey Keitel, I just don't think that the whole wolf scenario really plays out the way it maybe should, where there's so much hype, and maybe in retrospect, maybe that's kind of the point. Maybe Tarantino's actually having some fun with us because he establishes the wolf to be this kind of character who is almost majestic and miraculous and superhuman in some ways, and he basically then comes in and just says, well, let's clean the car up and put some blankets down.
Yeah, I still think the wolf character is great and well placed because it's kind of like a magician's sleight of hand. He's not really doing anything, and
Yes.
yet he so impresses the characters, and I think the audience to boot, that you can't help but just have an indelible impression in your mind about this character and Keitel's performance.
Mhm.
But I respect what you're saying. It didn't work for you, but now it still works for me.
Just not as much maybe as so much else about the film, but really the only thing that truly aged poorly, but it was bad to begin with, is that Jimmy character and Tarantino's performance for me.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the frequent use of the N word, especially used by white characters, I think it likely touches a nerve for many and perhaps stands as this movie's most egregious or archaic element. And you're right, Tarantino should stick to behind the camera. But I think that because the film is such a pastiche that blends myriad pop culture references and styles, fashions, music, and eras, it hasn't dated and arguably never will. Like you said, it's kind of like this bouillabaisse of so many different eras and cultures and styles that it's almost above reproach. How can you really criticize it or date it in any way?
Mm-mm.
But Tarantino has his own hipster style and panache that stamps movies like this as very grounded in 1990s postmodern sensibilities. And that could date the movie for some people. It doesn't for me, but maybe it strikes you as, been there, done that. That was very 90s.
Yeah, again, I think you're right that it could for some, definitely not for me.
Mm-hmm. So this is a birthday celebration after all, and birthdays are all about presents, except it's the fans who continue to get the gifts. So what is this film's greatest gift to viewers, Adam?
There's so much. I mean, the first thing that comes to mind when you ask that question is Ezekiel 25:17. Everything about that monologue that Samuel L. Jackson delivers is a gift that keeps on giving, I think, without a doubt. There are lines I still use on a regular basis, and I think that's probably the case for a lot of people. But if I'm in a situation, and it doesn't matter who I'm talking to, whether they get the reference or not, if someone in a conversation kind of out of nowhere surprises you with a bit of knowledge or insight, it takes everything I have to not say, check out the big brain on Brett. Like I honestly say that or think it almost every time. And,
Wow.
and even, and the other one, and again, maybe I'm the only silly person who does this, but I'm serious when I say that if I'm in a situation where someone's making breakfast or whatever, or we're talking about food and someone says that they don't like bacon, I'm like, but bacon tastes good. Pork chops are good. I literally just start quoting Vincent Vega. So there are bits of dialogue in this film that just stick with me, and I think will always stick with me, and I can't get them out of my mind. I think that we touched on it briefly. I think that Christopher Walken monologue is a gift as well. I think that's just a thing of genius, obviously because of how good of an actor he is.
And plus the timing, the delivery is just, it's almost like great comedic timing.
That's it. It's that he keeps the same kind of tone, almost somber. It's soothing, and the tempo of it is almost exactly the same throughout the entire. So it's kind of lulling you into a sense of complacency, so that when the joke hits, when it gets to the payoff, you are truly shocked by it. But because of the way it's set it up, you almost don't believe what you're hearing, and that's the moment too. Only when the pace changes,
Right?
When he finally does kind of tell the joke, then he speeds up the tempo a little bit, almost as if he's aware of how crazy this is and how bizarre it is, and it manages to be, again, this performance within the performance, but without it ever being cartoonish somehow, even though it very easily could be. So that thing, like I said, is genius.
Absolutely. Yeah, the dialogue. Hearing credible as well as quirky conversation uttered by infinitely interesting characters. To me, that's always going to be refreshing and satisfying. The movie has, some of the most quotable lines in all of cinema. I remember reading Roger Ebert's review, and he said that this movie would work as an audiobook. And he's absolutely right.
Yeah.
The narrative structure, as we talked about, the characters and situations, they take on different significance and they shine with more resonance because the story is not told in chronological sequence. This is really an off-putting thing for a lot of people. I don't know if you've ever had the experience of referring this movie to somebody who'd not seen it, or maybe not a Tarantino fan. But a lot of times in the past, I've done that, and they come back and they either love it, they get it, they enjoy the nonlinear kind of structure. But a lot of people they can't get their heads around it. It's too confusing. I'm not saying they're not intelligent film watchers, but it's too much work. It's not what they're used to seeing. But to me, I think it's just so genius because we realize, for example, that although Vincent, right, he's a fun personality to follow. He dies, as you put it, this ignominious death 2/3 of the way through the movie. His return in Act 3, after we know that he's soon going to be dead,
Yeah.
it possibly makes him less relevant as a character, and one that can serve as more of a kind of comic relief and sidekick to Jules.
Right.
A character who takes on greater significance in the last third of the movie than Jules does. So again, the nonlinear narrative, it forces the audience to pay closer attention and kind of compartmentalize each of the three main acts as vignettes that each tell their own important tale and yet also serve the complete story. And again, the gift that keeps on giving for me is the tonality. Tarantino, he's this master at mixing violence with comedy and building suspense out of both the extraordinary and the mundane. The black humor, the perfectly timed to counterbalance moments of extreme suggested violence. It gives viewers breathing room, and it makes the bloodshed and the disturbing content more acceptable. And you could describe this film as both distressing and delightful, as both silly and shocking, as both violent and hilarious. Would you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. I think you nailed it in terms of almost the way, the hybrid nature of this film. And I think we touched on this, and you've said it well, how there's no other filmmaker I can think of who does it the same way Tarantino does. That's the way he truly is an original and a unique filmmaker. And it's even more fascinating when you consider that not only are his films filled with all of these references, but in terms of the dialogue, but also there's a lot of cinematic references, and he's drawing on so many other films that he loves. And yet I don't think you watch a Tarantino film ever and say, well, he's just ripping off so-and-so. You're aware of the way he takes some of those elements, but infuses them with his own unique sensibility. And he always makes what can only be a Tarantino film.
Now, I'm not a film historian, but maybe you can correct me on this. A lot of people say that this was the film that kind of set that template for the meta film, the film within a film, or the self-referential film, or the movie that's kind of riffing on its own genre within itself. Can you think of earlier examples than Pulp Fiction? I'm trying to get to the root of, does Tarantino deserve that accolade?
Yeah, it's a great question, Eric, because I was thinking about that too, and wishing I'd spent a little bit more time to research it. I think we're probably wrong if we are going to say that we're very confident that no one had done the same sort of nonlinear approach, or certainly even chapter storytelling. I'm almost positive.
Godfather Part 2, you can point
Sure.
to that right away. I mean, that's an obvious one. But I'm getting more at the pop culture references and the kind of meta nature to the movie. I can't think of a movie that does it so frequently, that's built into its DNA like Pulp Fiction. I think it's really the first of its kind.
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly the one that gained the most notoriety and set the template, as we said, for so many other films and filmmakers to imitate it. So I think just by the nature of that, it points to whether it was timing on Tarantino's part or whatever it was, for it to be that influential. I think it speaks to the fact that it must have been groundbreaking, which means it had to be new. I love a film I remember watching in film school, Bertolucci's The Conformist, which is very dreamlike and is very much about memory and dances around in time. Now, again, that's a very different thing. Obviously, I'm sure we could, if with 5 minutes of Google searching, find lots of movies that jump around in time a little bit, but none of them did it as emphatically, if that's the right word, and as sort of joyously as Pulp Fiction did.
Yeah, the only other examples of the nonlinear structure that instantly come to mind besides Godfather 2 are Once Upon a Time in America. And then as far as my question, is this the first kind of meta movie? I actually have to correct myself. What about Reservoir Dogs, his first feature? The ironic thing, though, is that so many people didn't see that movie first.
No.
This is the movie that kind of launched let's go back and see what his first movie was about. That was certainly true for me.
Yeah, no, I think that's where it's really key. You're right. I was thinking about that earlier myself. That with Reservoir Dogs, Tarantino had already established that he liked to tell stories in a nonlinear way. So that wasn't necessarily what was new here, and certainly the meta elements and the pop culture references were there too. But that narrative structure, the overall structure of these different vignettes and these different stories that seem maybe like they might be connected, or we're not sure how much they are, and then we do see how they ultimately are, how they tie into each other. That was something that was different than with Reservoir Dogs.
Well, Adam, do you think this movie will still be widely watched and considered relevant in another 25 years? What would you say?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question, and I wish I had a fascinating answer other than it stood the test of time, as we've both argued anyway, and I haven't really heard anyone else try to argue that it hasn't. I'm sure there are people out there who do not love this movie or who appreciate it, but whether it was the 20-year anniversary or now, 25 years, it's a film that when people revisit it, it seems to still kind of hold that same magic, or as we've kind of touched on, we even see elements that we didn't fully appreciate the first time around, and it only grows in our esteem over time. So, who knows? It makes me think of a kind of fun experiment we did on our show for our 600th episode, where we had Chuck Klosterman on, great author who wrote a whole book about how we'll think about the past and the present in the future, and what films will be the ones that future film historians and film viewers and cinephiles, which will be the movies that they still talk about and watch, and what lens will they view them through.
That was a great episode, by the way. I totally tuned in for that.
Thanks. I mean, it was fun. It was one of those that obviously really made you think, and really made you think about film in a different way than you ever had before. And Chuck's thoughts were just wonderful in that episode and his picks. But I don't know that I have a feeling that Pulp Fiction will be viewed the same way, or we can apply that same kind of prism that like Chuck Klosterman did with some of his choices, or, that we'll consider Pulp Fiction in a completely different way. That said, all the same things apply as far as the filmmaking and the performances and the reverence for storytelling and dialogue. I feel like that's something we're always going to appreciate and want to go back and dissect.
Yeah, my take on this is the appeal and the cult of Tarantino. Agreed, it's a few years past its prime, perhaps, but it will probably persist for many years to come. I mean, he's only 56 years old, likely has many more films left in him. I know he's hinted at kind of retirement. That fact alone, I think, will keep what is considered by many to be his masterwork relevant for a long time. And also, because Pulp Fiction provides such a high return on viewer investment, I think it's going to be considered relevant, decades from now, too. It offers plentiful rewards and new insights on subsequent watchings. You mentioned yourself, you've seen it a few times. You watched it recently. Suddenly you're paying more attention to Butch or this element or that. But it will remain a fan favorite, I think we can agree, for the indefinite future. But then again, if we somehow become a more, let's say, politically correct society that increasingly frowns on violent or profane or disturbing content, not likely, in my opinion, but this movie could be less well remembered by future generations. What do you think?
Yeah, that seems fair. Again, I don't think that this movie, to use a word from this time that is popular nowadays, I don't think Pulp Fiction is probably as problematic as some of his other films. And of course, as I say that, I'm sure someone who hears this can say, well, I can point to 17 things I think are problematic about Pulp Fiction. That's fine. Mileage may vary, and I can point to elements myself. We already touched on some of the dialogue with the Jimmy character, but overall, it's not as in your face, perhaps, or as provocative as films like Inglourious Bastards or Django Unchained. And I wouldn't be shocked if there were aspects of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood even that forced some of those same questions and conversations. So Pulp Fiction may be a little quainter. It might be a film we remember a little more fondly and don't see as pushing the envelope as much as some of Tarantino's subsequent films have. But of course, you're right. You never really know.
Nope. Hopefully we'll be here in another 25 years to find out. All right, Adam, what are you currently working on that listeners should check out? Anything upcoming with Film Spotting or otherwise?
Filmspotting.net is where you can find our show, or wherever you get your podcasts. And it's funny that you ask what we're working on, and I can't even think about what we're going to talk about on next week's show. Of course, now I've stalled and it hits me. We're going to wrap up Avengers. We're going to see Avengers Endgame and talk about that next week. And And I guess because our show is the kind of show that it is, a bit of counter programming, we're going to balance out the Avengers with the second film in our Stanley Donen marathon, which is Funny Face.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, I think it should be good. And and some people might not be as familiar who are listening, but those marathons for us are really a key part of the show because we love to look at filmmakers or genres or whole sort of countries and their cinema that maybe have been blind spots for us for whatever reason. And we want to try to remedy that and kind of fill in the holes, as we say, in our cinematic education. So with Stanley Donen's recent passing, we thought it was a good opportunity to take a look at some of his films. So I'm really excited to see Funny Face this weekend and talk about it.
Oh, well timed. Well, I've said it before. I will say it again. Film Spotting, you can't listen to a better film podcast, and that's the truth. So keep up the great work, Adam. Say hi to Josh.
I will do that. Thank you very much.
Hats off again to Adam Kempenaar for agreeing to be a guest on Cineversary. Now it's time for Standing Ovations. This is where I give a shout out to a movie, book, website, TV program, podcast, or other work that I think would be of interest to classic film lovers. My standing ovation for April is a streaming service, actually. It's called Canopy, and it works in conjunction with participating libraries to provide approximately 30,000 gratis and commercial-free movies, including recent Academy Award winners and nominees, as well as classics and documentaries and Criterion Collection titles, and many other movies spread across different browsable categories. With Canopy, you get a limited amount of titles to play per month, and that depends on your library. For example, mine permits 5 titles a month. But the service is available on virtually every streaming device you can imagine, including iPhone, Android, Chromecast, Roku, Fire TV, and more. To see if your library participates, and that makes you eligible for a free Canopy membership, and to enroll, you just visit canopy.com. Now that's spelled Kanopy. I also want to encourage you to visit another website. It's cineversegroup.com. Now that's the portal for my Cineverse film discussion group that I launched 14 years ago and which continues to meet weekly in the South Suburban Chicago area. Cineverse is a democratic film society that watches and then discusses a predetermined movie that our members pick on a rotating basis. At cineversegroup.com, and that's spelled Cineverse, you can hear podcast recordings of our group discussions, you can read more about the films we study, and get a lot more goodies too. The reason I created Cineverse, and this podcast you're listening to, is to foster an appreciation for and an intelligent dialogue about memorable films. To me, watching a movie, that's, of course, a blast. But interpreting it, talking about it, sharing opinions and theories about it, that's even more enjoyable. I find the real pleasure is in digging deeper to learn how and why a film was made, the impact it's had on culture, society, and other movies, why that film has the power to evoke a strong emotional reaction in each of us, and what it can teach us today. If you want to email me a comment or a suggestion for a film we should feature on this podcast, you can reach me, Eric Martin, at cineversegroup@gmail.com. Now, I'd be much obliged if you spread the good word about this show to your friends and family. And if you enjoy this podcast, hey, do me a favor. Leave us good reviews on whatever platform you hear it from, especially iTunes. We would be ever so thankful. Lastly, count on tuning in next month to Cineversary. That's when we'll take a trip to France, circa 1959, to pay homage to one of the benchmarks of French New Wave cinema, Francois Truffaut's masterpiece, The 400 Blows, which turned 60 years old this year. This has been your humble host, Eric Martin, reminding you to butter up that popcorn, live a big screen surround sound life, and cherish those classic movies. Because here's a secret, folks, they're not getting older, they're just getting better. Thanks again for giving us a listen.